Thank you for reminding. Okay, so again, welcome to the class on Jewish views of the afterlife. We have just had a poll, and let's see what beliefs about the afterlife is. So I think you can see this, I hope. So first, my belief about the afterlife, 55% say something, not just living on in memories. 8% say nothing. 35% say don't know. And this is my favorite, only one of you took my bait. 2% or one person said don't know and don't care. And then for those that answered something, I believe in the afterlife, and I allowed multiple choice here, that it includes reward and punishment. That's 22%. Includes meeting friends and relatives, 41%. I'm making notes here. Includes pets, 16%. Don't know, 47%. And then after an afterlife, this is sort of an interesting, well, I'm interested in it. So is there something beyond the afterlife, or is it just an infinite existence? 31 said infinite existence. 4% resurrection in the time of the Messiah, 27% reincarnation, 39% don't know. And then another question, which I'm personally very interested in, and it looks like pretty even split. Does your belief about the afterlife affect your life? 45% yes, 47% no, 8%. Yeah, that was down at the bottom. 8% said not sure. Okay, so I'm going to close this, and I think nobody's waiting in the waiting room. So I'm going to begin the PowerPoint presentation. And the question I always ask whoops, boy, it's amazing to me how difficult this is. So somebody who knows what I'm talking about, do you see the presentation mode for yes, thank you, Cheryl. You've heard me ask this question a million times before. And I'm going to keep an eye on the chat. As always, I will invite questions to be asked on chat. I am going to mute everyone, and you can unmute yourself if you have a question that you want to ask in person. And generally speaking, ask questions in chat, and I will try and remember to pause for more direct questions or questions that are asked live. Okay, so the title of this presentation is Jewish Views of the Afterlife. And probably the most important part of the title is that letter S in views. There are lots of Jewish views of the afterlife. We don't know which one is correct because no one's come back to tell us. And I'll have a lot more to say about that as this program goes on. As I always do, I want to acknowledge my sponsorship by the Jewish Federation of Ventura County and the Joel and Barbara Aronson and their Affordable Living Choices Trust. Otherwise, I would be charging you for all of this. I do have materials on my website. Again, this is just something I've been saying in all the other classes. I don't know how many people are starting classes with me just tonight, but my website is lotger.com. If you go on the website, you'll see a little button there for classes. And if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see this class. I have posted copies of the slides that I'm showing. There's also, and I'll mention this, a very interesting Moment article, an article in Moment magazine, where you have about 10 or 12 rabbis writing a paragraph or two about what does Judaism say about life after death. And then I'll be posting videos of the sessions. And generally, I've also been sending out an email to everyone who sent me your email address with links to the videos of the sessions. So the first session is going to focus on biblical and rabbinic teachings. So what do Jews believe about the afterlife? There is a lot of stuff. There's Kabbalah, there's text. But the quick answer is, what do Jews believe? I don't know. Go ask them. I actually asked you, and now we have some polling. But the issue isn't what Jews believe. The issue is, what does Judaism teach about the afterlife? And this is a subset of something that's, I would say, very important for both Jews and Christians to understand, and that is Judaism's focus is on what we do much more than what we believe. Clearly, if you had no beliefs at all, you probably wouldn't follow any of Jewish law. But the focus in Judaism is on Jewish law. And in fact, God is quoted in the Jerusalem Talmud as saying, better the Jews obey my laws than they believe in me, with, I think, the understanding that by obeying the law, by being part of a Jewish community, our faith develops. So I like Woody Allen's response. He says, I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve it through not dying. Sorry, Woody. Sorry, everyone else. This is breaking news. The death rate is 100%. I repeat, the death rate is 100%. Everybody dies. Now the question is, how do we live our life? And the question is, what are the possibilities of existence after death? So the objective, and some of these slides I prepared when I was giving this class to much smaller groups in person, but they're more or less the same. To learn, what does Judaism have to say about what happens after I die? To investigate the Jewish texts that speak to this subject, which are the Bible, Talmud, Midrash, Zohar. I'll talk more about Jewish texts. To learn how Judaism addresses matters of faith in distinction to matters of practice. And then to share what we as individual Jews think about these ideas, and to strengthen our bonds as a community. And I was wondering whether to leave that community thing in, but you know what? I like it, because we are a community. I mean, here you are on the screen. There are folks from Texas. There are folks from New York, New Jersey, all around Southern California. Occasionally, I have one of my friends drop in from Guatemala City and Montana. And it's a community. It's a virtual community, but it is a community. So normally, and I'm not going to do this now, maybe we'll have time at the end for people to share. But if it was a much smaller group, I would just go around the table and ask you what you were taught by parents, grandparents, teachers, rabbis. What do you believe? If you believe in an afterlife, what do you think it's like? And the other thing which is interesting, and I hope in the last session, we'll have an opportunity to share more about this subject, which is, I know that many of you have had experiences relating to this question that can't simply be explained. So some of us have read books on the subject. Others, when I conduct classes like this, people are always telling stories, and some of them are astounding and I would say inexplicable. And I'll talk some from my own life, some from books that I've read that I trust. But I'm also interested in your own stories. So I would say at the end of every class, we can have some sharing for people that want to stay on. But we'll plow ahead. So according to a Pew Forum survey, 39% of Jews said that they believed in an afterlife. Let's see, that's, that our group said 55%. It was the smallest of any group, even smaller than the unaffiliated people with affiliated with no religion. 48% said they believe in an afterlife, and about half the average of 74%. So in the larger group, I don't know whether this was just Americans, but folks at large, about 74% said they believe in an afterlife. Half or less than half of that, about half of that was the Jewish response. But Jews had the highest response of I don't know or refuse to answer of any group, double the average of 7%. And my own theory, which I see I actually mentioned in more than one slide, is the Jewish instinctive reaction to the afterlife is that if it's so important to Christianity, we must not believe it at all. And that's not as far-fetched or as crazy as you might think. In Talmudic times, the there was a sign that Jews would make. I'm going to stand up so you can see this. They would make the letter bet on the across their chest as a sign of recognition for the opening letter of the Torah. But guess what that looked like as Christianity developed, and that practice disappeared rapidly. So distinguishing Judaism from Christianity has always been an issue. So that's actually one of my instincts as to why so many Jews are so sure that we don't teach anything about an afterlife. There are some excellent books that I can recommend on the subject. In order, I would say, of simplicity, this one, What Happens After I Die? Actually, I pulled these out. This is pretty thin, and it's pretty big type. And it goes into actually a lot of what we're going to discuss. Rabbinic thoughts. There are 13 chapters on different lines of thinking about the afterlife. I'm sorry, I'm just jumping in, admitting people. This one really, for me, was eye-opening, and you'll see how much I quote from this book. This is called Does the Soul Survive? By Rabbi Eli Spitz, a conservative rabbi in Southern California, and it really focuses, it says a Jewish journey to belief in afterlife, past lives, and living with purpose. So this is very much, this particular book is very much focused on the teaching, which, as you'll see, is mystical and kabbalistic, of the idea of reincarnation. And then if you really want to see a scholarly treatment of it, the book is called Jewish Views, again with an S, of the Afterlife. It is, 400 pages long, pages and pages of footnotes and bibliography. It's a PhD thesis, and very well documented and very well written. And Simcha Raphael has come out and spoken to our community about his work. It's very, very interesting, but it is a broad survey. He personally leans toward the mystical reincarnation element. So I just have some materials from these books, which I want to read to you. So this is by Eli Spitz. A woman in her 50s working on her doctorate in a literary field called to make an appointment to discuss her studies. She is a serious student, a particularly organized woman who is self-described as very rational. In the course of a conversation, she said, "Rabbi, I had an experience I want to tell you about. One night, I had a very vivid dream in which my brother, who died several years before, appeared to me and said that something important was going to happen. I was so startled by the intensity and vividness of the dream and the message that I awoke and sat on the edge of my bed. Soon the phone rang. It was my family thousands of miles away. They told me that my father had just died of a sudden heart attack. Neither I nor they had any indication that he had ever even been sick. A female physician told my wife," this is again Eli Spitz writing, "that while in medical school, a roommate awakened her one night at 3 a.m. saying, 'You are shouting, Daddy, Daddy,' and something about drooping eyelids. The next day, the roommate learned that her father had suddenly been hospitalized thousands of miles away with a severe muscle disease that affected his breathing and was difficult to diagnose. When she asked about his eyelids, which were indeed drooping, the doctors were able to make the diagnosis and save his life. Years later, when this same man was in a coma, his daughter flew cross country, repeating over and over to herself in her mind, 'Dad, wait for me. I'm coming. Don't die.' When she reached his hospital room, he suddenly opened his eyes and awoke from the coma. He said, 'I heard you say, wait for me. I'm coming. Don't die.' And I waited." Soon after he died. As the program goes on, I will tell you about experiences in my own family which track this, and I will be quite sure that some of you will have similar experiences. This one for me is almost the most profound one about prayer. And he talks about a rabbi from Orange County, California, who identifies himself as an ardent rationalist, shares the following. "About 10 years ago, my wife went into the hospital for routine surgery. Due to a surgical error, she developed a life-threatening blood infection, coupled with pneumonia and other complications. The doctor gave her less than a 10% chance of survival. She had a tube inserted in her throat to aid her with breathing, which prevented her from speaking. When they finally removed the breathing tube, she said, "While I was declining in strength and my pain was increasing, I became aware of all the prayers that people were saying to me. I could actually hear their voices. The prayers formed a cocoon-like structure around me. Each prayer added to the enveloping support." So far, so good. "Why is it," she asked, "that our friends the Weisses weren't praying for me?" What she could not have known was that the Weisses were in Europe around the time she went in for routine surgery. They did not know that she had been gravely ill, and I still have no way to explain her uncanny knowledge and the sense that words of prayer had kept her alive. So this to me is an example of something which forces my scientific left brain rational side to keep my mind open to the possibilities that these kinds of things are true. There are lots of examples I hear that aren't this clear. This is pretty clear. So the unsatisfyingly simple answer is something happens what we don't know. With apologies to any lawyers in the crowd, they tell a story of two people up in a balloon, and it goes up into a cloud and they get completely lost. And finally the clouds part and they're get close to the earth, and they see somebody standing there in a nice business suit, and they ask him, "Where are we?" And he looks up at them and he says, "You're up in a balloon." And they say, "Oh, we must not have understood. Let's ask again." And the other person said, "Don't bother, he's a lawyer," or insert consultant or whatever. How do you know? Well, we asked him a question. He gave us an answer. It was perfectly true, but it didn't help us at all. So there are lots of answers here. I don't know if they are true, and I don't know if they are going to be helpful, but they are interesting. Judaism has always held that there is something beyond the grave. I talk about this at every funeral, and I get people arguing with me about it. It's really only in very recent times that you have movements, and I would say the Reform movement might be one, where there's a significant number of thinkers in the Reform movement that would say there's really nothing, or they would make the true statement that we don't know. On some level, an afterlife is necessary to salvage God's reputation. Since it's pretty clear good is not always rewarded and evil is not always punished in this life, we need some kind of an afterlife where justice can take place. The something about the afterlife will have something to do with reward and punishment. Thus, there are Jewish concepts that, as you will see, sound a lot like heaven and hell. Having said this, we don't know the details. No one's come back to tell us. One of the things I'm always fascinated by when I speak with people from other religions, and they have the teaching, and it's very specific, sometimes astoundingly specific about what the afterlife is like. My question is always, how do you know? So maybe some of you, as the evenings go on and the classes go on from other faith traditions, can answer that question. So why does this answer surprise us that Judaism holds that there is an afterlife? For one thing, it sounds scientific. And in the last 100 or so years, Judaism has taken a very scientific change in direction and got away from kabbalistic and mystical teachings, more towards scientific and rational teachings. I would say in the last 30, 40 years, the direction of Judaism broadly has changed, and many more Jews I know are much more open to mysticism and mystical explanations. It sounds Christian, and again, I'll just repeat, afterlife is central to Christianity, and so I suspect that many Jews think if it's so important to them, we must not believe it at all. So let's begin with the Bible. What does the Bible have to say about the afterlife? First, the answer is not much. There is some discussion that hints at this throughout the Bible, and I'll mention some of these verses, and I think I even have some of the verses a little bit later on. God breathes into Adam, the first man. The word Adam means human. It's only later that it becomes a proper name. We would say Adam in English. God breathes into the human the neshama of life, and Adam becomes a nefesh. Neshama and nefesh probably in biblical Hebrew simply mean life or life force. As biblical Hebrew changes to rabbinic Hebrew, it starts to mean soul, and I'll have a lot more to say about the soul as the program goes on. We all know that Adam and Eve choose to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, in spite of the prohibition, or maybe because of the prohibition. That's a whole other very interesting discussion. And they ignore the tree of life, which we understand actually later in the story would give them and us eternal life. And then only after they eat and they understand, they have some insight into all this knowledge that they ate from the wrong tree, that then they are expelled from the Garden of Eden, and Keruvim, cherubs, guard the way to the Garden of Eden with a fiery, ever-turning sword. And then I always like to point out that the next time we meet Keruvim, cherubs, is in Exodus, where they're guarding the ark. So what's inside the ark? The Torah. What are they guarding in Exodus? The cherubs are guarding the Torah. What are the cherubs guarding in Genesis? The cherubs are guarding the tree of life. Therefore, for Jews, the Torah is the tree of life. And part of our liturgy is we sing, Eitz Chaim hi lemachazikim ba. The Torah is a tree of life, and all of those who hold fast to it are happy. So as it turns out, the Torah is literally a tree of life. It does literally grant eternal life, not to us as individuals, but to the Jewish people. Jewish people are the only surviving people from anything approaching these ancient times. Physical death is discussed in the Bible, and the texts are pretty clear and not terribly promising as relates to an afterlife. Dust you are, and to dust you shall return. That's the Garden of Eden. In the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, it says, in respect of the fate of man and the fate of beast, they have one and the same fate. Both goes to the same place. Both came from dust and both return to dust. From Samuel, we all must die. We are like water that is poured out upon the ground and cannot be gathered up. You will hear a couple of texts talking about Sheol. Sheol is mentioned in the Bible. You'll see the biblical mention. And I want to point out, for those of you who maybe are not so familiar with Hebrew, Sheol comes from the Hebrew verb sha'al, to ask. And a she'olah in modern Hebrew, probably in ancient Hebrew too, is a question. So Sheol has something to do with stuff we don't know. And you'll see some texts, I'll read them for you, that Sheol is a place we go down to. It's dreary, but it's not described as a place of punishment, and certainly not hell in sort of our modern concepts of hell. The concept of hell with which we're familiar with fires burning and punishment and torture and so on develops much later in the Greek and Persian periods. There are two people in the Bible, in the biblical stories, who don't die. The first is Elijah. Elijah goes up into heaven in a whirlwind, sort of a fiery chariot. And Enoch, in one of the early genealogies in Genesis, says Enoch walked with God and was no more, for God took him. So we're going to see, there is a non-canonical book, the Book of Enoch, and there's a lot of discussion in Talmud, and it comes up right to our Seder plate about Elijah. So Elijah is understood to have a special connection between earth and heaven, because Elijah never actually dies but ascends to heaven. So the rabbis of the Talmud are always bumping into Elijah and asking Elijah questions. And the real reason that we open the door on Passover is if Elijah shows up with the Messiah, we're going to ask him a question about drinking a fifth cup of wine. There's a question about, is there a Jewish concept of the devil? There is Satan. And in some of the Talmudic stories, Satan sounds particularly annoying, but I don't think has the same status that I see in certain Christian traditions, where it's almost an anti-God or a negative God with a lot of power on his own. But the devil is understood to be like a prosecuting attorney, looking for trouble, looking for things to accuse people of. Yeah, Jerry is posting, Satan is an adversary, very different. But in Talmudic treatment, it gets a little wilder. In the story of Saul, there is a woman of Endor who is able to call up the ghost of Samuel from the grave. I can't remember if I have an extended quote on that, because Saul is the king. He's going into battle. Samuel the prophet has always helped him and given him advice. Samuel dies. Saul's very nervous about going into battle. So against his own proclamation, he summons the ghost of Samuel from the grave. And there's some description here. I think I have the text. And then, yeah, you'll see there are some texts from Ezekiel and Daniel that hint of the idea of resurrection. And that's pretty much it in the Bible. So here are just some biblical texts from the Psalms. For in death there is no remembrance of you. In Sheol, who shall give you thanks? And Isaiah, for Sheol cannot praise you, death cannot celebrate you. They who go down into the pit cannot hope for your truth. And here's the story about Samuel. The king said to her, the woman of Endor. She's often called the witch of Endor, but in the biblical text, she's just a woman. The king said to her, don't be afraid, for what did you see? He's asking her what she saw. And the woman said to Saul, I saw a godlike man ascending from the earth. And he said to her, what is his appearance? And she said, an old man comes up and he's covered with a mantle. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed. And Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? And Saul answered, I am greatly distressed. And then he's going to ask for battle advice. So the important clues here is Samuel is coming up. He is not happy about it. He's old, he's not happy, and he's not happy about being disturbed. So that's a little more biblical, some hints of resurrection. So in Ezekiel, this is the dry bones text. Then he said to me, son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, our bones are dried, and our hope is lost, and we are clean cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, thus says the Lord God, behold, O my people, I will open your graves and cause you to come up out of your graves and bring you into the land of Israel. This is generally understood not to be talking about physical resurrection of individuals, but the resurrection of Israel from troubled times to modern times, that the state of Israel will be resurrected, or the kingdom of Israel would be resurrected and become a nation again. And then from the book of Daniel, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And the knowledgeable will be radiant like the bright expanse, the Hebrew word is Zohar, of the sky, and those who lead the many to righteousness will be like stars forever and ever. And in most rabbinic commentaries that I see, it's the Daniel text that is more pointed to as an example of teaching the idea of resurrection, not reincarnation, but resurrection. So just some images. You may know Endora, the Samantha's mother. So yeah, a magic worker, witch of Endor. And then here's an image of the dry bones. Very cool. Okay. Let me ask if anyone has any questions or thoughts. I'm actually going to try doing this. I'm going to stop share for a second. Hopefully I will be able to go back to sharing without too much trouble. But anybody have any questions or comments at this time?
Rabbi?
Yes, go ahead, Les.
In the Bible, doesn't it say that if voices come to you, that is to be ignored, that it's not something good if spirits are talking to you? Isn't that in our Torah?
Yes, there's a commentary that if somebody arises and claims to be a prophet, you are to be very, very skeptical. And again, every religion has to be pretty careful about closing the boundaries of prophecy.
No, I'm not talking about prophecy. I'm talking about when just the everyday person says like, oh, my grandmother spoke to me. It says in the Torah, doesn't it say that when you hear other voices that it's not pride, but it's not good?
Yeah, I don't think it's that clear. I think my sense of this is, and it would be worthwhile looking at those passages closely. My sense of this is that if you think it's authoritative revelation, if it's the book of Latka that I'm going to publish next week, you are to disregard that. But I have no question in my own life that I've had a very powerful sense of God speaking to me. I don't consider that revelation. I have changed my life based on that experience. I don't think that's what the Torah is forbidding. It's a very good question. Any other questions or thoughts?
Rabbi, I had a
Yes.
question.
Yeah, Tim.
When I was in Israel, it's like all the grave sites were near Israel or near Jerusalem.
Yes.
In hope that the resurrection is the way I understood it.
Yes.
So is that?
Yes.
What does that mean?
Yes. So there is the idea both in Judaism and Islam that with the coming of the Messiah or a final judgment day, that there will be a judgment, and the judgment will take place on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So, and you tunnel your way there. So location. So the best place to be buried is in the Mount of Olives, which is the hill right above the old city of Jerusalem. And there's also a custom of, which I'm sure many of you have seen, I did this just a week or two ago at a funeral, that earth from either the Mount of Olives or Jerusalem or Israel is in little packets in Jewish cemeteries, and we put that earth in the grave. And I almost think of it a little bit like a bloodhound, so you know what you're tunneling for to get to the Temple Mount. Any other question?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So when you talked about Sheol, does everybody go to Sheol, or like why was Sam?
We'll get into it. We'll get into it, and we're going to talk not so much about Sheol, because interestingly, in post-biblical texts, they don't talk much about Sheol, but they do talk about Gehenna. And with that as a segue, I'm going to jump back in.
Frumasera.
So, Frumasera, yeah. So one of the things when I had the class on Jewish insights from Fiddler on the Roof, and you have the dream of Frumasera and Grandma Zeidel showing up and bringing messages, which they're going to act on less. It's a very entertaining dream, but nowhere does Golda, Tevye's wife, question the fact that this is anything other than a message from the beyond, that in fact Zeidel shouldn't be marrying this person, but should be marrying someone else. Okay, Rabbinic Judaism and the Afterlife. This will be a review for many of you. Who are the rabbis and how they fit into Jewish history and thought? So Jewish history, certainly begins in temple times, and once upon a time, our religion was biblical Judaism, and the way we related to God was to sacrifice animals 3 times a day. The only sacred text was the Hebrew Bible, and there was really no clear mention of resurrection. So there was really very little. The concept of resurrection is really absent from biblical Judaism. With the destruction of the temple, we enter rabbinic times. And around this time, 2,000 years ago, you had different groups of Jews arguing with each other. Can you imagine that? Groups of Jews arguing with each other? And broadly speaking, you had the Sadducees, who were much more focused on the temple worship and the priesthood. And then you had a group called the Pharisees. And the Pharisees get a very bad reputation in the New Testament, but in fact, the Pharisees are the rabbis. And the distinctive belief of the Pharisees is in belief of physical resurrection and the day of the coming of the Messiah. And also, once the temple is destroyed, the Pharisees take over because the Sadducees have almost nothing to do. Being a priestly party, the Pharisees take over and they substitute prayer and mitzvot and study of sacred text for animal sacrifice. And that's the way Judaism has been for the last 1900 years. And so what that means is, and I'll show this chart, which some of you have seen me show many times before, that there's a lot of Jewish sacred literature beyond the Hebrew Bible. So here is the Hebrew Bible. It is the same books as a Protestant Old Testament. They're in a different order. The Torah reached its current form, according to scholars, about 400 BCE. The prophets about 200 before the Common Era, writings in the year approximately 90 of the Common Era. But Judaism teaches that when Moses was on Mount Sinai, Moses got an oral revelation with the instruction never to write it down. That becomes the Mishnah and the Talmud. And ultimately, it answers the question, how are we going to be Jewish without a temple? So and I choose my words deliberately and carefully, the Mishnah and the Talmud reform Judaism from a religion based on animal sacrifice by a priesthood at the one and only place in the world where you can do that, into a religion based on mitzvot and prayer and study of sacred text. And one of the hallmarks of Rabbinic Judaism is this teaching about physical resurrection, even in the earliest days. And again, it gets more complicated. And, I guess I'll have to teach a class about Jewish sacred text, but not now. So with Rabbinic Judaism, with this new concept of Judaism being taught, a whole other list of important terms come into play. And certainly these terms, Olam Haba and Olam Hazeh, are commonly used in Rabbinic Judaism. Olam Haba means the world that is coming. It's funny, I didn't translate it here. Haba means to come. Olam is the world. Olam Hazeh is this world. Atid Lavo, probably less commonly used about what is to come in the future. There's a lot of discussion that we'll see where I go after I die. There's a lot of discussion. Actually, this is all the discussion of what the world to come will be. So there's a rabbinic idea which is going to talk about our lives in the future after our death. And so one understanding of the world to come, Olam Haba, is simply what happens to us as individuals after we die. One of the confusing things about this is it also refers to what the world will be like, or the status of the world in the day of the Messiah. And the same term is used to mean both things. Sometimes the world to come, or even the heavens, are called Gan Eden. Gan Eden is the Garden of Eden. So you have this concept of Gan Eden as the world to come. And to this day, traditional Jews will talk about one's share in the world to come, with the understanding that as you do good deeds in this world, it improves your chances of a good result in the world to come. And the things that help you are good deeds, suffering, and this is an interesting and troubling but a concept we see in rabbinic literature, that one reason for suffering in this world is sort of the paying the price of that help you in the next world. And one idea, Bryce is raising, why would suffering help you, is in the mystical concept that you're paying for sins. So just like, you pay your ticket and now you don't have marks on your license, or you serve your time in prison and then you don't have you're not still liable for crimes that you've committed. There is definitely the concept of paying in this world for sins you've committed in this world, and as we get into mysticism, maybe even sins you've committed in previous incarnations. And again, it's about justice. There are things, that help you lose your share in the world to come, sins, heresies, and so on. And as we'll see, very importantly, you don't have to be Jewish. It's very clear in Talmudic literature that the righteous of all nations have a share in the world to come. That's a statement in the Mishnah that's repeated over and over again. And one of the things I often point out to people who are studying for conversion, technically you're supposed to discourage people 3 times if they want to convert to Judaism. And that's a traditional teaching. I don't discourage people so much. But one of the interesting things is that converting to Judaism may be hazardous to your spiritual health, particularly in the world to come. And what do I mean by that? If you're Jewish, you are subject to Jewish law, which, as you may know, there are 613 commandments in the first 5 books of the Bible. The good news is that only about half of them are applicable today, because many of them relate to the temple worship service, some only to the land of Israel. The bad news is the rabbis were unsatisfied with just that number of commandments, so they added thousands more. As a Jew, according to traditional Judaism, you will be judged by God on how well you did against those hundreds and maybe thousands of commandments. As a non-Jew, what does it mean? It says the righteous of all nations have a share in the world to come. As a non-Jew, you're only judged according to what are called the 7 commandments of the sons of Noah. And they're pretty straightforward ethical prohibitions against murder, sexual crimes, animal cruelty, theft, blasphemy, and there's an affirmative commandment to set up courts of justice. So as a non-Jew, that's what Judaism teaches. That's what God will judge you on. So it's not 100% clear, at least not to me, that being Jewish is good if your focus is on the next life. So here's some interesting texts. This one is kind of a challenge to your analytical thinking. So this is all from the same part of the Mishnah, the Pirkei Avot, on Olam Haba, the world to come. Better is 1 hour of repentance and good works in this world, Olam Hazeh, than the whole life of the world to come. And then immediately after that, it says, better is 1 hour of spiritual bliss in the world to come than the whole life in this world. And you can puzzle over how both of those things can be true. But at the heart of it is the only place you can do God's work is in this world. I talk about this at every funeral. As wonderful, as terrific as the next life will be, and I talked a lot about that in the class we had on Jewish mythology, and the videos of the classes are on my website. As wonderful as that it is, it's only in this world that we can do God's work. So that becomes incredibly important, but the world to come is still going to be great. 1 hour of spiritual bliss, better than the whole life in this world. When King David died, Solomon, his son, sent this inquiry to the Beit HaMidrash, the study hall. My father is dead and lying in the sun, and the dogs of my father's house are hungry. What should I do? Their answer was, feed the dogs first, and then attend to your dead father. Living dogs take precedent over a dead king. Okay, so this is the text about righteous Gentiles. This is from another one of the books, Sonsino and Son. As to the fate of non-Jews, the rabbis of the 2nd century differed sharply. So this is rabbis of the Mishnah. One rabbi, taking a minority view, argued that Gentiles do not have any place in the world to come. The position of another sage rabbi, Yehoshua ben Chanamah, prevailed. Righteous Gentiles have a place in the world to come. This view was affirmed by the great medieval philosopher and legal scholar Maimonides, who stated, the pious of all nations of the world have a portion in the world to come. So here are some descriptions of what this world to come might be like, what paradise might be like. One sage maintained that 3 things, namely Shabbat, sunshine, and sexual intercourse are central in this world as well as the world to come. He was not alone in viewing paradise as a sensual place. We read that the righteous will sit at golden tables, and this is reference to Ta'anit, tractates of the Talmud, on stools of gold, ketubot, and participate in lavish banquets from Bava Batra. A 3rd century Babylonian scholar, Rav, disagreed. In the world to come, there is neither eating, nor drinking, nor procreation of children, or business transactions, no envy or hatred or rivalry, but the righteous sit enthroned, their crowns on their head, and enjoy the luster of the Shekhinah. The majority of the rabbis saw paradise as a place of reward, agreeing with Rabbi Tarfon, who taught, you know that the bestowal of reward upon the righteous will be in the time to come. So again, I want to point out something for those of you who may be puzzled by this. And those of us that have studied Talmud, we have Talmud study at Temple Adat Elohim on Zoom, 8 o'clock Pacific time, Saturday mornings. There are all kinds of contradictory things taught in the Talmud, particularly as they relate to beliefs. And this is a perfect example. Let's say after this class, we have a big discussion and about what we think the afterlife is about. And some of you are going to line up with resurrection. And some of you are going to line up with reincarnation. And some of you will talk about 7 levels of heaven. And some will talk about 3 levels of heaven and different visions of Gehenna, of hell. And we can't come to any kind of agreement. Is that a problem that we can't agree on that? No, it's not a problem at all. Now, I always use this example. Let's say we were meeting in person and we had this wonderful 3-hour discussion about the afterlife, and now it's lunchtime or dinner time, and we're serving chicken for dinner. And we can't agree on the question of what makes a chicken kosher. Is that a problem? Big problem. We can't eat. If you can't eat, it's a big problem. If you disagree about the nature of heaven and hell, it's not a pressing problem at all. So Judaism, by and large, is obsessed. I don't think obsessed is too strong a word, about what we should do, much more so than what we should believe. And that is a huge difference between Judaism and Christianity. So what is hell, Gehinnom, like? The term Gehenna dates from the biblical period, referring to a valley in Jerusalem called Gehinnom, the valley of the sons of Gehinnom. It is the site of a cult whose rituals included sacrifice by burning of children. So they would sacrifice to the god Moloch by burning children alive. This is the Jewish vision of hell. And the name of that valley, which is it's in between the King David Hotel and the old city of Jerusalem. There's a valley running through that. If you head to the right, you will find the valley that they were talking about. The Talmud says wrongdoers of Israel who sin with their body and wrongdoers of the Gentiles who sin with their body go to Gehinnom and are punished there for 12 months. Although some sages argued that after 12 months they would be annihilated forever, Rabbi Akiva taught that the judgment of the wicked in Gehenna shall endure only 12 months. After this year, he taught, and his teaching prevailed, that even the wicked would be returned to paradise. This is the source of the custom of mourning parents for 11 months. Now, how do we get from 12 months to 11 months? And what does mourning have to do with any of this? The idea is that reciting the mourner's Kaddish, which is an ancient Aramaic prayer, except for the last line, it's not in Hebrew at all, it's in Aramaic, where you're praising God in the name of your deceased loved one. The teaching is that reciting that prayer assists the journey of the soul from this world to the next world. That's why it's much more intense in the first 7 days, month, and year after the person's death. And then annually on the Yurtzeit, you also recite the mourner's Kaddish. So the idea is while your parents are in Gehenna, you are doing good deeds in their honor, because you get credit for it and they get credit for it. And as I taught the class on superstition on Sunday, they're even aware of your doing good deeds in their name, and there is the concept of posthumous felling, which I'll be happy to discuss in more detail. So you're trying to help them literally get out of hell, and you do it for 11 months. Why 11 months and not the full year? Well, you don't want to make a public statement that mom or dad required every last day in punishment, like a purgatory, to work off their sins. On the other hand, you can't be too careful. So everybody observes that period of mourning in traditional Jewish law for 11 months. And also, nobody asks you, what do you think? Well, thinking back in my childhood, I would say 4 months and 3 days. You're not going to be asked that question. Everybody does it collectively, so no one is shamed. And as Cheryl was pointing out, one of my favorite ones, I can never remember what I have in my text. I'm pretty sure I have this. The people in Gehenna are given the day off on Shabbat. So as Friday night approaches, don't ask me what time zone Gehenna is in. I guess Gehenna Standard Time. What a silly question. They get off for a day. And I learned in reading from my class on superstition, the fires of hell are put out during this time. And then at Havdalah, at the end of the Sabbath, they are forced to come back into Gehenna. They go through, I guess, metal detectors or ice detectors, because there are specific prohibitions against stealing snow to bring it in to try and cool things off for them in Gehenna. And something I came across just in preparation for the talk on superstition is an explanation for smelling the sweet spices of Havdalah is to overwhelm the smell that you would otherwise be smelling, which are the fires of hell being stoked anew. If this doesn't make any sense to you, don't worry about it. Let's see. Rabbi Chanina in the Babylonian Talmud, Baba Metzia 58b, taught that punishment was temporary, namely a maximum of a year for everyone, except the following: the adulterer, the one who puts his fellow to shame in public, and the one who calls his fellow by an obnoxious nickname. So if you agree with Rabbi Chanina, here are 3 specific things to avoid. I want to do a digression because it's so central to the differences between Judaism and Christianity and the role of Messiah. Forgive me if you've heard me go on and on about this. I will be brief, but I think it's important to mention the Messiah in this context. The English word Messiah is a translation of the Hebrew word Mashiach. Mashiach means anointed. In ancient times, kings of Israel, when they ascended their kingship, had holy oil poured on their head, either by a priest or a prophet. And the verb to anoint is mashach. One who is anointed is a Mashiach. There are 39 references to the word Mashiach in the Hebrew Bible, and not one refers to a future redeemer or forgiver of sins or someone who atones for sin. When the Hebrew Bible is translated into Greek, it's a Jewish translation, 200 years before the Common Era. The Hebrew word Mashiach is translated into the Greek word Christos, meaning anointed, which gives rise to the English word Christ. So I'm always very careful when I speak about Jesus. And as you might guess, in interfaith settings, I talk about Jesus a lot, to refer to Jesus as Jesus and not as Christ. The Jewish understanding of Messiah. Like the afterlife, the Messiah is barely mentioned in the Bible, except as referring to every king of Israel, and even one non-Jewish king, Cyrus, who is called God's anointed because of the good things he does for the Jewish people. There is no mention in the Hebrew Bible of a Messiah to come who will do, great and wonderful things. There's mention of the idea that the throne of Israel will always be in the lineage of King David, and since in these times there is no Jewish king sitting on the throne of Israel, we believe that someday there will be, or we are taught that someday there will be a Jewish king sitting on the throne of Israel. And that king, of course, will be anointed, therefore will be Mashiach. In all of Jewish teaching, I should say there's a wide array of thinking on the nature of the Messiah, but they all agree on a few things. First, the Messiah is fully human and only human. Probably always discussed, and now I'm thinking of Talmudic discussions, as a political or military leader like King David. The Messiah in Jewish thought is not God or the Son of God or the child of God in any sense beyond the idea that we are all children of God. And this is always a very important surprise and something for Christians to learn about Judaism, that the Messiah is not understood anywhere in Judaism to be connected with redemption of sin. As you know, in High Holidays approach, only we can atone for our sins, for sins against God, if we're sincerely regretful of the sin and we promise and succeed in not practicing the sin again. We believe God is both just and merciful. But for sins against people, for sins against other people, we are taught that God cannot forgive those sins unless the person you've sinned against has forgiven you of that sin. And as I think you know, Messiah is not at the heart of Judaism. I can't remember where I asked this question of a group, of a Jewish class I was teaching, about whether they've ever spent any time in synagogue or in their Jewish world discussing Messiah other than the differences between Jewish understanding of Messiah, Christian understanding of Messiah. And almost no Jews discuss Messiah a lot, with the very important counterexample of Chabad and Hasidic Judaism. And particularly Chabad is very much Messiah focused. So the Jewish prophecies concerning Messiah, time of peace, peace among people, beating swords into plowshares, even peace among animals, lion and lamb lying down together, all the world will come to know the one God. Importantly, this does not mean all the world will be Jewish, but all the world will come to know the one God, the God of Abraham. The details are unresolved. The mystics see it as a supernatural time. The rationalists believe that we will do the work to make the world perfect. It's actually Kafka's quoted with the idea that the Messiah will come one day after he is no longer needed, which I understand as the Messiah will come when we've done the work to make the world as close to perfect as it can be. The Messiah will come to say Mazel Tov, that you've done a terrific job. And in the Reform movement, we focus more on the concept of a messianic age rather than an individual Messiah. So my handy dandy has the Messiah come test is read the LA Times cover to cover every day for 30 days. If there's no story of war, hatred, animosity, hunger, disease, the messianic age might be here. Clearly it's not. So the reason, and I won't dwell on this, we don't accept Jesus as Messiah is no world peace, no Messiah. And none of the other, Jesus doesn't fulfill a single Jewish understanding of Messiah and messianic age. Christianity responds by saying Jesus will come a second time and fulfill those prophecies. But the larger issue isn't so much whether Jesus is the Messiah. In the first century, groups of Jews could have a legitimate debate about whether Jesus was the Messiah. And in Jewish history, there have probably been 20 or so, or maybe more, people who various groups of Jews have held to be the Messiah. The most notable was Rabbi Akiba declared Bar Kokhba to be the Messiah. But when the Bar Kokhba revolt failed in 167 of the Common Era, it was clear he was not the Messiah. There was another person declared by the Messiah named Shabtai Tzvi in the 1600s that had an enormous effect on Jewish history, and people continued to believe he was the Messiah up until the 1800s. The idea of God taking human form and dying for our sins is a beautiful idea, but it is definitely not a Jewish idea. So I have great sympathy for Christianity and its teachings, but I have less sympathy for Jews for Jesus or Messianic Jews. Their argument is, well, some Jews are waiting for the Messiah, We happen to be a group of Jews who believe that the Messiah has come, and it happened to be Jesus. The issue isn't the nature of Jesus. The issue is the nature of the Messiah, and even more importantly, the issue is the nature of God. Yeah, that's the point there. So moving on to resurrection. So we've seen the biblical text, particularly Ezekiel and Daniel. Resurrection, as I mentioned before, becomes a primary teaching of the Pharisees, who were the early rabbis. And the concept of resurrection becomes so central in Christianity because the early Christians, I've discussed this with Christian scholars, were following Pharisaic teaching. Interesting interfaith issue. The rabbinic proofs of resurrection, this one you're not going to be impressed about, I will say in advance. When the sea splits and we have the song at the sea, here the text reads, Moses and the children of Israel will sing Yashir to the Lord. Happy are those who dwell in your house, so you'll be praising you forever. It's always translated as, and Moses and the children of Israel sang. And there's some interesting biblical grammar going on here, but just trust me on this one, it's clearly in the future tense. So the rabbis lock on to the fact that someday we will sing. How can we sing if we know all of these people are already dead at the time we're reading this text? The answer is they will be physically resurrected. And Rambam's, the Maimonides' 13th principle is, I believe with perfect faith that there will be a revival of the dead at the time when it shall please the Creator, blessed be his name, and his mention shall be exalted forever and ever. So there is a standard rabbinic belief teaching, rabbinic belief and a rabbinic teaching in physical resurrection. So for some of you who are pretty familiar with the liturgy, in the second prayer of the Amidah, which is called the Gevurot, which speaks of God's power, when we recite this prayer in the Reformed liturgy, we say at the very end, Baruch atah Adonai mechayeh hakol, which means, blessed are you Adonai, mechayeh, who gives life, hakol, to everything. The text in conservative and more traditional movements ends with mechayeh hametim, which is the rabbinic teaching, mechayeh, who gives life, hametim, to the dead. So that's preserved in the Amidah. It's interesting that in the most recent Reform movement prayer book, you have an option of reading either text in the Hebrew. And there's somebody making noise, but I can't tell who it is. Okay, more Jewish teachings on the resurrection. There are lots of conflicting ideas about your physical appearance after the resurrection. This is stuff you may not have thought to worry about, but now I'm going to give you more things you have to worry about. Who you be married to. Remember, these thoughts are coming about in a time when, women died in childbirth quite commonly. So marriages to subsequent women, subsequent men for that matter, were not all that unusual, and they're not so unusual today. So when everybody's resurrected, who's your wife? These issues, to my knowledge, are not resolved, and we don't need to resolve them. There's conflict about who will be denied resurrection. Some ideas say one who denies resurrection. If you say there's no resurrection, as we say in ancient New Jersey, forget about it. One who says the Torah is not from heaven is denied resurrection. One who reads heretical books or utters charms over a wound, practicing magic. One who pronounces God's name with its proper letters. We're a little safe there since nobody knows how to pronounce God's name, but these are various rabbinic teachings about those who will not be resurrected. But certain paths to an immortal life include studying Torah, living in Israel, getting married, leading others to do good, and speaking Hebrew. Once when I think I told the story once when I was walking on the streets of probably Jerusalem, maybe Tel Aviv. Guy comes up to me and asks me, "Do you speak Hebrew?" And he asked me in Hebrew, and then he asked me in English when I didn't respond. And I said, "No." And he said, "You're in big trouble, because when you go before the divine court to determine your fate in life," and we'll read more about those ideas, the court is going to be conducted in Hebrew, and therefore you will be in trouble. So I only hope when I'm resurrected, I have Google Translate with me in my phone, because as I've learned, that can be actually a very helpful tool. And I do know a little Hebrew now. I don't know if it'd be sufficient to defend myself in that court. And again, this is another thing to point out, what I point out, I think, sometimes ad nauseum. In early rabbinic Judaism, there is no systematic theology. This is worth repeating. In rabbinic Judaism, there is no systematic theology. What would a systematic theology be? A systematic theology would be a description of all of these issues. What's the nature of God? What's the nature of heaven? What's the nature of hell? Who gets in? Who doesn't get in? What does God really want of us? What's the most important commandments? All this stuff is theology. Judaism, by and large, particularly in rabbinic times, is uninterested in theology. The only thing Judaism seems to be obsessed with and very interested in is what you're supposed to do. What makes a chicken kosher? How do you hang that mezuzah on the wall? How do you tie the tzitzit of your prayer shawl, of your talis? Not so much what's the nature of God and how does resurrection work? Around 1,000 years ago, under the influence of Muslim theologians in Spain in particular, Jewish thinkers, Jewish philosophers in Spain, my oversimplified way of explaining this is that they get a little embarrassed by the fact that we don't have an organized theology. So Rambam writes, Maimonides writes his famous Guide for the Perplexed. So if you're perplexed about Judaism, Rambam is going to lay out a very Aristotelian, logical description of all of this. Richard is asking a really interesting question. Do you think the Christian concept of Messiah makes God more personally accessible than the Jewish concept? I do think the Christian concept, I would say, of God makes God more personal and more accessible. And here I'm just reacting to the language I hear my Christian friends speak. When they're discussing a difficult problem, they will talk about praying upon this problem. I prayed about it last night, and here's what I've come up with. I hear Christians all the time talk to me about a very personal, intimate experience with God. They're speaking about Jesus. So, and it's been a very successful religion. I don't know if you know this, but there are a lot more Christians than Jews. Christians are probably a third or so of the world's population. Jews are 0.2%. Suzanne is raising, so much of Torah, God repeatedly says, I am God, I am the only God. That is not theology. Are you asking it? Are you saying that's theology? Yeah. So it would be curious to see. I mean, one of the things I love to talk about is in the early books of the Bible, particularly Torah, God is not being presented as the only God. The early books of the Torah describe a world that would be known as not as monotheism, but monolatry, that there are many gods, each nation has their own God, but our God is the most powerful God. Notice God says in the 10 Commandments, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt to be your God. You shall have no other gods before me. That doesn't say there are no other gods. It just says, I want to be first in line. In the Michamocha, it says, who is like you among the gods who are worshipped? Clearly saying there are lots of gods who are worshipped, and no one is like our God. The prophets come along to make the assertion that you've just made, and I would certainly say that is theology, that there's only one God. But the details biblical Judaism doesn't seem to be so interested in. Yeah, so I talked about Mechaya HaKol and Mechaya HaMatim. So here is the article that I mentioned from Moment Magazine. It's called, What Does Judaism Have to Say About Life After Death? And you probably have 8 or 10 different rabbis writing a few paragraphs on that subject. I used to, before electronics, I would have 20 copies of that, and I would have them available at every funeral, shiva call, hospital call, because so many Jews, here I will say this is true, so many Jews in the throes of dealing with death, whether we're talking about at a, at the side of the bed of someone who is dying, at a funeral, at shiva, are comforted by the fact, and I will say this is a fact, that Judaism teaches that there is something beyond this life. That is comforting. Whether it's true or not is another question. Whether it's comforting or not, at least in my experience, is not a question. And that takes us as far as I wanted to go this evening. So I am going to stop sharing and ask if anyone has questions, comments, alternative sermons. Let's try and be a little light on alternative sermons. So any questions? Yes, go ahead.
I don't know if you plan to talk about it in the next sessions, but sort of the Jewish rituals around death, is that a coming topic?
Yes. What you'll see, actually, if you download the all the slides, you'll see actually a lot of the third session has to do with rituals of mourning, shiva.
Then we won't get into the burial and all of that stuff. I had a question about that, but I'll save it.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Any other questions?
I got one if you take it.
I will take it. I don't know how well I can answer it. Go ahead,
All right.
Murray.
All right. For example, let's say the other day I was doing nothing and I was listening and I heard a bird singing, chirping outside.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought to myself, damn well that is conveying some sort of information. I have no idea what's happening in the bird world. Maybe they had a good find of worms or something.
Mm-hmm.
But your Google Translate doesn't translate bird talk.
Right.
And my feeling is all of this is so human-centered because we're no different from a pigeon or a blue jay or whatever. I mean, we're just animals on the earth like all the other ones.
Okay, so let me respond. If there is no truth to any of this Jewish stuff and religious stuff, then what you're saying is absolutely true. And the 3 sessions on science and religion, this was a central issue for discussion, which is if there is no God, then you're absolutely true. We are self-aware organic hydrocarbons. We speak a different language than bird talk.
Much more complex than whale talk or elephant talk, but still within the realm of
and indeed the worms are also organic hydrocarbons, and the bacteria are organic hydrocarbons.
And worms are going to eat me, right?
And if there's no truth in any of this, then there's nothing to ask. We are a fortunate accident of nature.
So now, I appreciate every second. That's why.
Well, but let me point out something else. I know of people at funerals that will say, the deceased was a lover of butterflies, and they will start seeing butterflies at the funeral. My wife Sonia, who is the mystic in the family, has the same thing about butterflies. And once in her life, she was in a very troubled state of mind. I probably ought to hasten to add, this was before I knew her. And she had to make a difficult decision, and she sat down in a green belt near where she lived, and butterflies just started landing on her. And I'm talking about more than just 1 or 2. And she saw that as a sign. I would say one of the central teachings of Kabbalah, I don't remember if I get into it in this class, is we are surrounded by signs. But if we are so focused on our on our rational approach to life, we can disregard all the signs. If we're open to them, it's very powerful, the amount of signs that are there. So just like any language, in order to get something out of a language, I have to understand it. If I were a bird expert, I might be able to not literally translate the language of the bird, but I might be able to know a distress call from a mating call, a call for, I don't know.
Well, these signs you talk about are kind of like, you're not surprised, but you're glad when you find two puzzle pieces that fit. Because
Yes.
normally life is just random, but when something connects,
So I
and
would
then you see
say,
a bigger picture now, then
so
get that appreciation.
let me move on. But I would say a mystic and a religious person would not say normally life is just random. I would say a mystic and a religious person, certainly in the Jewish tradition, would say life has meaning, life has purpose. We have been given guidance, and then it's up to us to decide whether we are going to follow the guidance and thereby fulfill the meaning that's been assigned to us, or treat it as though it's random. Jane.
So then you're saying that most Jews do believe that there is that there is something after death.
I didn't say that. What I would say is Judaism has always taught that. What Jews
Okay.
believe is their business, and I have no idea.
But there isn't the belief in reincarnation, of coming back in another form or another life as somebody completely different.
We are going to get into that. Remember this book, Jewish Views of the Afterlife,
With
plural.
the S.
So I would say the standard rabbinic belief, and by rabbinic, I mean something very specific. I don't mean me and my buddies. I mean the rabbis of the Talmud believed in or taught resurrection. The mystics, the kabbalists, are going to be very focused on reincarnation. And certainly, my friend Eli Spitz is very focused on past lives and reincarnation. So I would say Judaism believes, or there are Jewish teachings of both of those and a lot more. One of the things that I find fascinating, and we do have some very knowledgeable Christians among us, if they're still here, Christianity absolutely holds with the idea of resurrection. But my understanding is it is completely inconsistent with Christianity to hold with the idea of reincarnation. Whereas certain Eastern religions, such as Buddhism and Hinduism and so on, all dabble with the idea, or maybe even hold the ideas, I'm not terribly knowledgeable in those traditions, of reincarnation. So there's lots and lots of different Jewish beliefs. The only one you don't find widely taught is the idea that there is nothing.
Okay.
That becomes sort of, I would say, a recent intellectual contribution from Jews who I would say are dominated by an intellectual approach, and who would argue that, that your only afterlife is the memory of those who love you and remember you. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
you.
You are welcome. Any other questions or comments? Okay, so hearing none, I am going to stop the recording.